President Reagan was often called the great communicator. Did he deserve this description? And how important is it for a leader to be a great communicator? Is it overrated or is it essential?
We've had some pretty good presidents that were great speakers. Dwight Eisenhower wasn't the most motivational speaker that you ever heard. But I think, again, it isn't just his speaking. I'm one who believes, watch what they do, not what they say. And I think that's one thing we have to do, and that was one thing that was consistent about Ronald Reagan. I remember being with him in Missouri, a group of governors. It was during the Iran-Contra, and there was a little bit of heat, and they organized a meeting on education and invited half a dozen of us governors to be there. And he took some questions, and but he was comfortable. I think the people, and as I say, I wasn't close to President Reagan. I didn't have a lot of direct contact with him, but he was comfortable in those things, and he took all the questions, whatever you wanted to ask. He took them and answered them well. But Ronald Reagan, to me, was not the detail guy. He was the guy who laid out the vision, laid out the program. I met with, we always had an annual meeting with the governors and the president would come in and make a nice presentation, and then the staff would take over on a lot of the details. A lot of executives don't do that. They like to handle all of that themselves. But I think that's another key. I think he knew how to delegate, and those of you who worked closely with him would know that better than I. But to me, that's the most significant thing that a good leader can do, is learn how to pick people and then give them the responsibility and hold them accountable for it. So, but I think it's absolutely helpful to be a good communicator, and I don't think any of us have ever seen a better one.
In his ability to communicate, sometimes just by short one-liners, he communicated things even other than exactly what he said. Do you remember when he was shot? What he said when he was right there in the emergency room that put everybody at ease. He talked to the people in the emergency room and he said, "I hope all you doctors are Republicans." Now apparently things were so tense at that period of time that nobody paid any attention to him. They didn't even laugh. Once he got into surgery and they were prepping him and getting him in there, he used the line again, and that time it brought some laughs. What he was communicating as that got publicized and in the paper was, "I'm okay, I'm all right." And I think that was an amazing example of just a short one-liner of a man who wanted to communicate, you know what, it's all going to be okay and I'm all right, and even that he trusted the doctors, even if they weren't Republicans. He wasn't insisting that they be. So I loved that about him.
I think the biggest mistake he made is replacing Jim Baker as chief of staff with Don Regan. When he made that change, he screwed up the whole operation, and they came to him and suggested they wanted to do it. And he had confidence in both of them, so he agreed to it, but it turned out to be disaster, didn't it?
Hadn't thought about that, but you're absolutely right.
You have to know California history to know the answer, know the significance of this, but he was very unhappy with judicial activism. And the position of Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court came up, and he personally interviewed a number of the people that were being recommended for it, including the presiding judge for the Los Angeles Superior Court, whom he finally selected to appoint as Chief Justice. And within a year, the man had totally reversed everything that he had promised Reagan. It was going just the opposite. And he just said, when I asked him the question, as governor, what's been your biggest regret? Appointing so-and-so as Chief Justice was the biggest mistake I ever made.
What things will people be saying about Ronald Reagan 100 years from now?
I think one of the most important things is tear down that wall to symbolize the way he was on national defense, the attitude with the Russians, and amazing what he accomplished with the Russians. He changed the whole world.
Does he deserve that credit?
Yes. Yes, he does.
Why?
Because he was willing publicly to stand up and make those challenges to the Russians. I was there and I was on defense appropriations, and I literally believe his attitude, not just what he said, but his attitude changed that relationship with the Russians so dramatically. So 100 years from now, 200 years from now, that was a dramatic change. You just can't imagine how it made a difference when we visited Russia. The attitude, the way we were greeted as senators traveling over there after he stood up to them.
What kind of attitudes did they have?
Well, it was so anti-American and so suspicious of everything. You really felt uncomfortable when you were visiting Russia or any of the officials. And I can't describe, night and day describes what a change it made in how we were treated in our relationships with the Soviet Union to become Russia.
Was he really that indispensable to this issue of Russia versus the United States?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because of his willingness. A lot of people were critical at the time. Oh, he's going to cause a war because of being so candid and so direct and so forceful. Well, the result was just the opposite. It dramatically improved relationships with the Soviet Union.
I don't know whether it's going to work, speaking of Star Wars, but he said neither do the Russians.
Yeah.
And he says that's the beauty of it. We'll spend them into bankruptcy trying to find out.
Precisely.
I was looking through Rex's journals last night to try to find a one-liner or something, and the one I found, when Rex went into interview with President Reagan, just before he was appointed to be the Solicitor General of the United States, Rex was so impressed with his persona, his ability to just visit with him as a person and want to know what he was like. He asked about his family, and the one thing that he wrote in his journal was President Reagan asked him about ethics, if he could give him a definition of integrity or ethics. And Rex shared with him his favorite definition of ethics, and that came from Justice Potter Stewart, past Supreme Court Justice. And what Justice Stewart said, ethics was knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is the right thing to do. And President Reagan loved that. And they shared that and talked about it. And Rex was so impressed, as I am, with a man who stood up for what he believed and was not afraid to say what he believed, and yet was able to do it in such a gracious manner.
As we look at the presence, everybody here raised their hand that he would be in the same category of those that are Mount Rushmore. Well, you look at those, do we remember those 100 years later? No question we do. You can get book after book about Lincoln and read all of his quotes and things like that. More of those will be with Reagan, I believe. We could probably go around this table and all of us would call back a quote that he made or something that he said. I remember after he was shot, myself and Denny Smith were down at the White House, and someone said something, what should he have done? He said, I should have ducked. And so you get down the idea, you know, he said that was my biggest mistake. And he came close to dying. I mean, when you talk to those doctors, incidentally, when they asked if they were all Republicans, the chief surgeon said, today we are.
You know, none of us know what we're going to be talking about 100 years from now, for sure. But I think that you look at Lincoln, and Lincoln had a rough presidency. I mean, it was tough. He had nothing but trouble, nothing but opposition, and yet he was remembered because he stood his ground. And in a political system that kind of wanders, as ours does, I think that those who have been consistent, those who have defended the right, those who have stood for the things that last, because we're, you know, none of us know where we're going right now. We're in kind of a limbo situation as a nation, and we've got to have, we really need someone who gives the clarion call. The scripture says, if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who will heed to the battle? And I think we'll remember that Reagan didn't give an uncertain sound. He talked directly and spoke the truth and led us in the right direction. And it doesn't take us long to get off of that direction if we're not careful.